The good detective, J. Warner Wallace, tries to bamboozle his audience by misattributing the writing on this slide to being the work of Thales, a first-century skeptic historian. It is not. I will call on William Lane Craig, as well as Dr. Richard Carrier, to refute the detective who again fails to prove his case in his video, One Proof the Bible is Correct. Since Wallace is not correct, why should we have any reason to think the Bible is correct? Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members.
If you're writing in the first century in the Egyptian area, these are the most popular names for Jewish men. None of those are in our, well, only one, Joseph's pretty popular, in our New Testament accounts. But it turns out the most popular first names for men in the area of Palestine are these names, the names that appear in our Gospels. So it appears that the gospel authors at least know what people are called in the first century in the region in which they're writing. And that's why you don't have any names except for the big ones in the Gnostic Gospels, because they don't know what they were calling people over there. These are all false Gospels.
This is an odd claim. Wallace claims the Gnostic Gospels are false Gospels. Do these Gospels use names that were not yet in use during the first century, particularly names of places not yet built, or maybe references to technology not yet known? These are some of the tells that brought many scholars to the realization that at least portions of the book of Daniel were written in the 2nd century BCE, not the 6th, as claimed by the book itself and many modern apologists. Yes, I know, the book of Daniel contains lies. Big shocker there. I'm wondering if Wallace will show us what names appear in the canonical Gospels that don't appear in the Gnostic Gospels. Since the writers of the canonical Gospels often had the works of other writers in hand, as evidenced by the verbatim copying of some of Mark into the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, why think these later writers didn't also have these texts? Some of the later Gospels were written specifically to refute claims by the earlier Gospels, according to Bart Ehrman. So of course the writers were familiar with the names in the texts as they read them. Will Wallace give us any evidence to back his claim that they didn't?
These Gnostic Gospels coming out of Egypt.
I didn't realize he was limiting his talk to only the Gospels coming out of Egypt. It's unfortunate for us that he hasn't identified what Gospels he's referring to. I think this is intentional. My theory is he wants the audience to think that he's referring to all non-canonical Gospels. If I was in his audience in my believer days, that is certainly what I would have thought, and thus my theory. Some may even extend his claims to all non-canonical literature about Jesus from the first 3 centuries, thus would include epistles as well. What books might Wallace be referring to? What Gospels came from Egypt? It's possible that he did identify what he's referring to, but unfortunately, our video doesn't begin at the beginning of his talk. He's likely referring to the Nag Hammadi, a group of 52 texts discovered in Egypt in 1945 by Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, an Arab young man that was fleeing police after avenging his father's murder. He found them in the cave where he hid. So when Wallace says that these books came out of Egypt, they literally did. But did they originate in Egypt? Were they written by Egyptians? Unlikely, as they were originally written in Greek. Even the Gospel to the Egyptians was originally written in Greek. This doesn't preclude Egyptian authorship, since writing was rare in the first 2 centuries. To write in a language other than one's own mother tongue was even more rare, according to Bart Ehrman. I went back and listened, and nowhere does Wallace claim that the authors are Egyptians, just that the books came from Egypt. Yet at the start he implies it by making this claim.
If you're writing in the first century in the Egyptian area,
this is why I find Wallace deceitful at best and dishonest at worst. If you are writing in the 1st century in Egypt, implying that what he is talking about is books written in the 1st or 2nd century in Egypt, but never actually making the not only unsupportable claim, but highly unlikely claim that these books had Egyptian authors. It is not surprising he uses this tactic. Detectives and lawyers use this to plant information in a witness's head before the information is asked for. For example, if you want to establish that John was wearing a blue hat, you might ask, when you were seated at the table, the person in the blue hat was seated on your right, correct? Was that John? Was John wearing a hat? What color was the hat? A line of questioning like this can plant information in a witness that the witness may not have remembered without the prompt, or it may be entirely fabricated by the examiner. Either way, it's designed to tamper with the witness's memory.
Usually when it comes to cities, they will only mention one city, Jerusalem. Why? Because that's all they knew from over there in Egypt.
Again, implying Egyptian authorship, unlikely, without actually making the claim. Here's the passage from the Gospel of the Egyptians that has the most names in it. None of them are names of places, other than a spring, and none of the Egyptian names that Wallace has on the screen even appear in this Gospel. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't even tell a story of Jesus' life. Rather, it's a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. Thus, I wouldn't expect to find place names in it. The Secret Revelation of John is a book that could contain place names, but when I checked, I didn't find any. But I found lots of names of people, spirits, and demons. Gnostics find the material world flawed or evil and consider the creator of the material world a lesser god. They seek knowledge and spiritual enlightening. The body is a hindrance to that aim. Thus, a list of demons that put together the human body. You know what I don't see among these names? Any Egyptian names. So why does Wallace keep trying to point to Egyptian names as evidence of Egyptian authorship? And what does any of this have to do with his topic, which is supposed to be one proof that the Bible is correct? Even if everything Wallace said to this point was absolute truth, what would this have to say about the Bible?
Yet the gospel authors writing in the region early knew all the names of the cities that were in the region early.
Okay, so the writers of the canonical Gospels knew the names of the cities in the region that they wrote about. This is it? This is your proof? We're still just in the Spider-Man analogy. Just because Spider-Man lived in New York and New York is a real place, doesn't mean that Spider-Man is real. You know what I have found? Authors of novels usually set their characters in places that they know. That way, they get the names of the cities, streets, beaches, stores, and restaurants accurate to the location. You know what this doesn't do to the novel? Make it a true story.
There's another way to go. What if I had another eyewitness, an ancient eyewitness that wasn't a Christian? What do the pagans, the non-Christians, say about Jesus in the years closest to the life of Jesus?
I'm going to skip ahead a bit here. He talks about what would be corroborating evidence for a bank robbery and talks about how the suspect can explain away some of the evidence.
They are not Christians. They don't believe it's true, but they back into certain claims that I'm going to write on this wall for you. Here's Thales, for example, in 52 AD. On the whole world there pressed the most fearful darkness. This is at the point of the crucifixion. And the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thales, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, it appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. So here we have a guy who's not a Christian, who's saying that that darkness that occurred at the resurrection, it wasn't supernatural. It was just an eclipse of the sun.
Wallace wrongfully claims to have the words of Thales as quoted by Julius Africanus. It may seem picky to note that it is not quoted by, but rather from Africanus. It is not. Wallace's slide misattributes the quote. It actually is the work of Julius Africanus, a believer. The works of Thales have been lost and are known only through the writings of others, primarily Christian historian Julius Africanus, who wrote in the late 2nd century. Africanus is talking about Thales, but not quoting him directly. According to William Lane Craig, so did Thales actually refer to Jesus' crucifixion and the attending darkness? Some have suggested that Thales may have spoken merely of an eclipse that occurred around that time, which Africanus takes to refer to the darkness recorded in the Gospels. So the connection of the eclipse and the darkness at Jesus' crucifixion was made not by Thallus himself, but by Africanus. Support for this view may be found in the citation of Phlegon, who is said to have mentioned an eclipse during Tiberius' reign, but so far as we know from other citations of Phlegon's work, did not refer to the darkness at Jesus' crucifixion. Craig then suggests it's merely possible Thallus wrote before the Gospel of Mark was written. He wrote in the early 1st century, but exactly when we don't know. If Thallus wrote of such a darkness after the crucifixion but before Mark was written, Craig concludes, in that case, what Thallus delivers is not independent confirmation of the Gospel accounts, but evidence of the primitiveness of the pre-Markan Passion tradition. Craig considers this still to be remarkable as evidence of historicity, because it would mean that this oral tradition arose early. However, he would directly refute Wallace's claim that this confirms the Gospel accounts. What I find odd about Craig's position is acknowledgement that we don't know if Thallus was even referring to the crucifixion, then claiming that Thallus confirms the historicity of crucifixion events, even though he might not have been writing about the crucifixion.
But in order to back into that statement, he has to give us certain facts that he agrees are true. Apparently there's a guy named Jesus who was lived and then was crucified, and at his crucifixion there was an earthquake and darkness. Now, it's not for why you Christians think it was, but he has to back into this. I'm in the bank, but I'm not doing a bank robbery.
And none of this is established by Thallus, as Thallus didn't say this, Africanus did. All we know that was in fact from Thallus is a description of a darkness that he says was an eclipse. I'm now wondering if Wallace has even read his own slide. The second sentence in his slide says, "This darkness," Thallus says in his 3rd book in his history. This is all in quotes. Why would Thallus ever refer to his own book that he's in the process of writing? And yes, it took me this long into the script to notice this. I've had Wallace paused here for 2 hours while writing and just noticed this third-party reference now. Those of you who caught it sooner, kudos. But you can see how this would fool the audience that doesn't get to pause the slide for 2 hours looking up other information about Thallus. I'm wondering if Wallace is fooled by his own slide. Does he really think that he is reading a quote from Thallus? The world may never know.
How many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop? The world may never know.
All the things on Wallace's list, then, are not attestations about Jesus by an unbeliever. Rather, they are the affirmations of what Africanus, a 2nd century believer, thought about Jesus. That a believer affirms the beliefs of his own religion is not at all remarkable.
Do you see what he's doing here? So we know this about Jesus, even if we had no other evidence about Jesus, just from the statement of Thallus.
No, because this is not the corroboration that you claim it to be. Rather, to put it into Wallace's bank robbery scenario, it's like the bank robber's brother supporting the robber's story. Hardly surprising and of very low corroborative value.
Tacitus does something similar. The historian who's not a Christian, who's talking about the destruction of Rome by Nero, he says that consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition. What could that be? A mischievous superstition. Thus, checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular, kind of like Los Angeles.
Not all scholars agree that this is authentic, but the majority do. He likely did write this.
He's going to offer that some things here that he thinks are true. He's not a Christian, not a believer, but he's confirmed certain facts. He's confirmed that Jesus was called Christ and that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. His followers persecuted. He's even confirmed something I won't go so far as to say. There is some kind of mischievous story out there. What could that be? The resurrection?
Wallace goes too far. Tacitus writes that there is a mischievous story out there, and Wallace surmises that he means the resurrection. despite a moment ago claiming that he wouldn't go so far as to name it, and yet here he does. Even if Tacitus did mean the resurrection story, all he confirms is that the story is circulating, not that there was a resurrection, or that anyone witnessed a resurrection, or even that he knew of anyone who claimed to have witnessed a resurrection, merely that the story was out there. I would not dispute this. The story was definitely out there. The story began soon after Jesus' death. I'll grant him that too. But neither of those things make it true. Just as stories of Elvis being alive began to circulate just one day after his death, does not mean that Elvis resurrected, or that he was still alive when these stories were popular. They were still just stories.
We may have the very first non-Christian account of the resurrection, at least being reported here.
That word may is doing some heavy lifting here. We don't even know if Tacitus is talking about a story of a resurrection. Even if he is, he clearly doesn't think it's true. This is like talking to a gathering of conspiracy theorists and saying that rumors that the FBI was involved in the JFK assassination began to circulate just days after JFK died, and one person who wrote about the rumor was a reporter that didn't believe the story. We may have the first non-believer account of the FBI being involved in the JFK assassination at least being reported here. But to an audience of conspiracy theorists, they would likely all nod their heads and see it as evidence for the theory. Why? Confirmation bias. This is all Wallace is appealing to here. Tacitus confirms that stories of the resurrection were circulating. So what? Did anyone doubt that such stories were circulating?
The people were talking about this as early as 56, 60, 65 AD.
Why would this be evidence of anything? 56 CE is still 20 years after Jesus died. At this point, most people hearing the story are likely to respond with, Jesus who? There is no question that the stories began to circulate soon after Jesus' death, and that the Gospels were written about 40 to 80 years after his death, so that the stories about it were circulating in the meantime is not at all remarkable.
Here's Maraber Serapion, who is a Syrian philosopher, writing to his son about three philosophers, and he talks about Socrates and about Pythagoras, or the Jews, who he says murdered their wise king. After that, their kingdom was abolished. God rightly avenged these men. The wise king lived in the teachings he enacted. Here's a reference to Jesus. He's calling him the wise king. Apparently, the Jews caused his death in some way. Phlegon says this early on, quoted by Origen. In the 13th or 14th book, he said in his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. And Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that they arose after death.
First, you probably noticed right off the bat that Wallace again has a slide that implies these are the words of Phlegon, as he claims Origen to be quoting him. But again, Phlegon is not being quoted by Origen, as the slide claims. Rather, Wallace is quoting Origen, who is writing about Phlegon. And now the history gets really murky. Origen was a believer and early church father. The knowledge of future events referenced here is to Phlegon's description of the same darkness and earthquake that Thales was describing earlier. Here's the work of Origen being quoted by Wallace. Major problem arises in that Eusebius, another church father who quotes Phlegon verbatim, makes no mention of Phlegon making any reference to Jesus. If Phlegon had referenced Jesus and not merely the simultaneous events of an earthquake and an eclipse, Eusebius would most certainly have mentioned it. Quoting Carrier here, we know Eusebius used a chronology of Thales as a source, and that it was almost certainly the very same histories cited by Africanus. The implications are decisive. If the histories of Thales mentioned the eclipse in connection with Jesus, Eusebius would certainly have quoted Thales here to that very effect. Instead, Eusebius knows only a passage in Phlegon, the one also referenced in the extant text of Africanus, although here, notably, quoted verbatim, even though it does not mention Jesus, proving how more certainly Eusebius would have quoted Thales verbatim if he had mentioned Jesus, and other Greek chronologers. I'm omitting some of Carrier's support for his argument for brevity's sake. See Homer Hitler Bible Christ for the rest of the support. Therefore, we can conclude that to a very high degree of probability, the passage in the third book of the Histories of Thallus that Julius Africanus was referring to said only this: the sun was eclipsed, Bithynia was struck by an earthquake, and in the city of Nicaea many buildings fell. This means Thallus probably made no reference to Jesus, nor showed any knowledge of the Gospels. The eclipse is not said to have occurred in Palestine, and Bithynia is in Turkey, nowhere near Palestine. Worse, this calls into question the dating of Thallus' writing. How? Because Thallus used Phlegon's history as one of his sources, and this would argue for the conclusion that Thallus wrote after Phlegon, whose work is dated to 120 to 140 CE. Thus Thallus should be removed from the list of writers attesting to Jesus, as should Phlegon. We need to fix Wallace's slide for him, on the evidence that he's provided so far. There, Jesus was a wise king. And even the term king is used loosely here, as Mara bar Serapion called Plato and Socrates the other two of the three kings. Does Wallace have anything else?
And exhibited the marks of his punishment and showed how his hands had been pierced by nails. These guys don't believe this is true. They're just reporting what they're hearing from others.
No, they absolutely believe this is true, because you aren't quoting Phlegon here. You are quoting Origen, a church father.
But here's my point. If you lost every piece of Christian literature ever written by anyone, and all you had were the remarks and reports of non-Christians in the first 100 years, here's what you'd know about Jesus.
Jesus was a wise king. Not much information.
It's touch point corroboration. And that to me is powerful. That's a lot of information.
Only when you get exclusive control of the narrative and manipulate the evidence to say what you want it to say. But any attorney worth her salt would rip your case to shreds, as I just did, because you based your evidence on the assumption the believers accurately reported what unbelievers were saying. In other words, you used hearsay. Now, with ancient history, we must use hearsay, as the original writings rarely exist today. But clearly here, the evidence of bias on the part of Origen and Africanus in reporting what the secular historians said is evident from Eusebius not finding those same references to Jesus despite using the same sources. It's akin to two of your buddies giving you an alibi for the time of the crime, but a third buddy refuting the other two. Since your own buddy is testifying against you is less likely to be biased than the one testifying for you, that third buddy's testimony is going to be weightier.
So we test our eyewitnesses. And as I tested the eyewitnesses, I think as much as they could ever be verified, these are reliable.
They are not reliable because you have misrepresented the evidence. You have misrepresented who the witnesses are. This, sir, in a court of law would be thrown out as inadmissible evidence.
If there were no miracle accounts in the Gospels, nobody would distrust them.
Possibly. That's really hard to say. But if there were no miracle accounts in the Gospels, would there even have been a religion formed about them? Not likely. We'd maybe have a book of sayings of Jesus. Without the Roman government making Christianity a state religion, it would not likely have survived. Without their miracle stories, you have nothing more than an itinerant preacher going around preaching, like thousands of others of his day. None of us would likely have even heard of him.
If Jesus was just a guy who came and preached the Sermon on the Mount, and that's all he ever did, is preach the Sermon on the Mount, no serious historian would ever doubt the existence or validity of the gospel accounts.
I think you have that backwards. If all Jesus ever did was preach the Sermon on the Mount, no serious historian would ever have reason to consider him anyone worthy of knowing or writing about. If the historian personally met Jesus, he'd have no reason to doubt his existence. But shy of meeting him personally, he'd have no reason to think anything about him one way or the other.
They are only doubted because they contain supernatural elements.
Absolutely not true. There were plenty of stories of supernatural events in Jesus' era. The founding of Rome contained such elements. The Iliad, the Odyssey, Julius Caesar rising from the dead, and so on. Did historians think that such stories were true? I have no idea, nor does Wallace, because we don't know the minds of first-century historians beyond what we have in their writing. And even then, we have what they wrote about such events, not whether or not they personally thought that these events happened. Wallace is projecting modern skepticism on first-century people. We can't know if this is how they thought or not.
How about this? Are they honest and accurate over time, or have they changed? This guy killed his wife in 1981, and he told everybody that she ran off, abandoning their small children, 5 and 8 years old. And Carol, he said, just left, and everyone believed him. Even Carol's family believed him. We had no physical evidence because we believed him. In 1981, we took a missing persons report. We didn't work it till 1987. 6 years went by. When we finally decided this was a murder, we called the family and said, hey, she came home, right? She came, clearly you would have called us if she never came home. And they said, no, she never came home. They believe she ran off. For 6 years, disappeared, no financial record, never shows up again anywhere, is now in the 2000s. Really? We opened a case. We had no physical evidence, not a single picture of the crime scene because he had moved. We never worked it as a homicide. It was a missing persons case. Without a single piece of physical evidence, they convicted this guy in 4 hours. 4 hours. Keith Morrison said, this is the one case, Jim, I don't believe you got right. No one believed it. He confessed, though, at sentencing. So we know he's the killer. And the reason why we convicted him was because he changed his story over time. He had one story in 81. He had one story in 86. He had one story in 96. He had one story in 2012, one story in 2014. You change your story over time, adding details that didn't exist prior, you're probably lying to me.
The video ends abruptly at this point, wondering if there were some tech issues with this one. The thumbnail doesn't match up with the video very well. It's the names on the first slide, which Wallace never tied to his points on secular historians. He made the claim that the Gnostic Gospels came out of Egypt, and he never used the names on the slide to make any point about the Gnostic Gospels. He merely claimed that the names in the Gospels don't match up with common names in Palestine in the first century, but offered no examples of names in these Gospels that one wouldn't expect to find in a first-century Palestinian writing. Then we get nothing to tie this video together, or even to indicate what the one proof is that the Bible is correct. Correct about what? Everything? The life of Jesus? The earthquake? What is it that Wallace thinks that he has proven? Next, by his own words, Wallace convicts himself. Thallus and Phlegon make no mention of Jesus, as evidenced by Eusebius. But Origen and Africanus changed the narrative to claim that they do. Thus, we dismiss the accounts of Origen and Africanus as they are probably lying to us. And Wallace, claiming to quote secular historians when in fact he is quoting believing church fathers, is also probably lying to us? I actually don't think he is. I think he's just sloppy. He has seen these quotes from Christian sources, evidenced by the fact that these quotes are easy to find on numerous Christian websites, and he trusted them to be reliable, as his Christian bias tells him that most of what he finds in Christian sources is reliable. He likely has certain sources that he doesn't even bother to check, as I did when I was a believer. After all, Christians follow a morally upright God that would never lie, cherry-pick data, or misrepresent sources, right? Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England. Live your life. This week, a fresh hot chocolate chip cookie goes to Data Jack. Jack, at this point, you probably need some milk to go with all those cookies. Here you go.